Good morning, everybody. How are you? Welcome. Thanks for getting on today. Today, we're going to be talking about real estate investing. We're going to hit kind of just scratching the surface on real estate investing. There's a lot to it. So, we're going to kind of run in through some basics, and that's why we call this Real Estate Investing 101. We're going to be talking about building wealth with rental properties today. Now, before we get into it, first of all, I want to say good morning to everybody. Everybody that's on looks like Kenise, Christy, Sherry, Leo. Good morning, everybody. Anybody else watching Facebook Live or any of the other live channels? Good morning. If you're watching live right now, drop a comment, drop a good morning. Let us know you're there. Give it a like on Facebook or wherever you're watching live. But appreciate everybody being on. So we are going to dive in to building wealth through owning real estate. Now, first thing I want to touch on is let's go back. If you've been following our wealth journey here for a while, I believe in a wealth creation. I believe that in wealth creation, it's a cycle or a circle that never stops. I think it's something that's ongoing. I don't feel we ever hit a point where it's time to stop. And with that, we have to be thinking about. Actually, Leo, can you real quick pull the live stream starting in a few minutes off, please? The banner running across. But with wealth creation there, thank you. The first step in wealth creation is we have to create income. And then we need to increase our income. And then we need to start putting plans around how to offset taxes legally and how to plan to start putting a wealth strategy in order, putting it together. Kathy, good morning. Joe, good morning. Then we need to begin saving that money. And then we need to add a pillar of income. What I see happen with a lot of people is they try to add the second pillar of income and the passive income without step one and step two, which is create income and increase income. And that can become a problem because I'm going to talk through some practical experiences, some things I've gone through here with owning real estate and with people taking on debt in real estate as well. But before we even think about adding our passive income pillar, let's go maximize every ounce of time we have to go create income and increase it and get ourselves to become a high income earner. I promise you, when you start buying real estate and you have money and you have financial resources and reserves, cash reserves to deal with problems that might arise with owning real estate, you're going to be in a much better position. I did it backward and I did it the hard way. And I'll talk through some of my personal experiences here, but I started acquiring real estate without having any income or very little income, and it was painful. There were some painful times there. So this is our creation here: create income, increase income, plan, tax plan, save, add a pillar, save, add another pillar, save that money, add another pillar. So in time, our goal is we want to get our passive income to exceed our expenses. By definition, if my passive income exceeds my monthly expenses, financially, I can live forever. If I have $7,000 a month that comes in passively, whether I do nothing that month, if I just sit on the couch for the entire month, but I have what they call quote unquote mailbox money coming in, and it's $7,000 and my expenses are $5,000, financially I'm okay, unless some unforeseen financial thing happens where my expenses go through the roof. But keep that in mind with our wealth creation. Now, let's talk about key objectives today. We're going to introduce the fundamentals of real estate investing. We're going to share some practical steps for buying rental property, and we're going to provide actionable advice from personal experience from myself. I still own a decent amount of real estate, most of which I acquired between like 2008 and 2012 when the market downturn happened. And so I'm going to talk about some personal experiences, how I got into it, and how I acquired the properties without really having any money, and the experiences I've dealt with, both good and bad. So again, if you have questions throughout this, drop them in the comments. We'll be sure to get them answered, whether you're on Facebook or StreamYard or wherever you're watching, drop them in. Now, first question I want to ask is, why invest in real estate? Well, I want you to think about, depending on the age, think about the house you grew up in. Think about the house you grew up in, or maybe it's your first house. Maybe you bought your first house 30 years ago. Or let's just take, for example, because everyone can relate to this, the house you grew up in. What if, and some of you may still, what if you owned that property today? What did your parents pay for that property? And what is it worth today? 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, what is that property worth today? Chances are it's worth substantially more than what they paid for it. And so if you think about that, what if you started thinking from this aspect, instead of selling a house that I live in, what if I kept every house I lived in and bought a new one? I kept it and rented it. the value will go up over time. Even when we had the downturn in 08, 2009, and 10, when property values declined, they did bounce back and they kept climbing. So over time, real estate will appreciate. But think about the house you grew up in. What is it worth today? And what if you own that property today? Now, we can't go back and change time, but my point here is your parents probably paid a pretty low, relatively speaking to today's dollars and what values of properties are today, they probably paid a very, very small amount for that property. They might have paid 20 grand. They might have paid 10,000. Your grandparents might have paid $5,000 per house. Who knows? But that property today is probably worth significantly more than what they paid for it when they bought it, however many years ago. So there is significant wealth building potential in owning real estate because real estate tends to appreciate. We tend to have appreciation on the value of real estate. And so what we need to look at is with our real estate investment plan, we can be getting real estate appreciation, long-term appreciation of that property. And we can also be getting cash flow on that property. That's why, I feel with real estate, you can make money flipping, right? Like a lot of people want to get into flips to get that quick pop of money. I used to flip houses. It can work. You can make money. A couple of challenges. You're not really building wealth. You're getting income, and you're getting taxed at the highest level because it's income. And so flips can be fantastic to get money, but then what are we doing with that money we're making? It's the same way I always talk about with as a real estate agent. You as a licensed real estate agent have the potential to earn unlimited income. You can make as much money as you want. Right? There's no cap, there's no ceiling on it. But what's just as important as earning the income is what are we doing with it? Do we have a plan in place to then buy things like real estate and invest our money so it can start paying us a return and generating and creating wealth for us over time? Now, the third point here with why invest in real estate, and one of my favorites, is there are significant tax benefits and you can leverage the equity of the homes that you own. We're not going to dive too deep into the tax benefits today or the equity piece because that's going to be a whole separate training of its own. But Google cost segregation, a cost segregation study. And basically, I just want to touch, I've talked on this before in our tax strategies trainings, so you can always go back and watch those as well. But a cost segregation study, basically, instead of depreciating my single family residence that I have as a rental over 27 and a half years, I can do a cost segregation study, fully depreciate that property in the first year of owning it. I can take advantage of bonus depreciation, which I know bonus depreciation has gone down and is continuing to go down. With Trump coming back in office, though, there's talks that maybe that bonus depreciation will go back to 100%. Who knows? I don't know. We'll see what happens. But just Google cost segregation and go back and watch some of our tax strategy trainings in Network Global Agents, and you can check that out. So significant advantages in owning real estate. Let's talk through them now. Now, let's understand some rental property basics. So first of all, what types of property am I buying? Can I buy? I've got rental, I can choose from single family homes, multis, condos. I wouldn't advise on condos right now just because of the insurance stuff going on with them. But single families and multis, and then getting into the bigger stuff like apartment rentals, owning apartment buildings. There's a lot of money in that, and there's a lot of ways. We're not, again, this is 101, so we're not going to talk too much into that. The bulk of what I own is mixed up between majority single family homes and some multis, a couple of multis, 2 families, a 4 family, a 3 family. And so we look at that, and then we have to look at key factors to consider. What are my location? Location does matter in real estate. Market trends, tenant demand. How would I know what tenant demand is? Well, I can go quickly, like you all have access to Maris. You can click the lease feature on Maris and start looking at what rental prices are going in the area. You can also go to sites like Zillow and look under rentals and get an idea of what homes are renting for in specific zip codes. Doing homework on this stuff is going to be very, very important. Then what I also want to do is set my investment goals, my cash flow versus appreciation. What does that mean? It means, am I looking to find properties, potentially lower end properties that maybe I don't have to have as much cash to get into the deal, lower price points that have a good cash flow, or am I looking for properties that tend to appreciate a little bit better? Or am I looking for a mix of both? And again, I'm going to talk on some of the stuff I did here when we get to just a couple of slides in here. So I want to start understanding the property basics of what is my plan, because I find with a lot of people, you have to establish a plan. Like, you know what, I'll just dive into it. I started my first property I bought. I was flipping houses and 08 hit. And what I noticed was on areas of St. Louis, specifically where I started first buying my properties were in a zip code of 63118. What I noticed in that zip code was that in like 05, 06, 07, I got into the industry in 2005, properties in that area that needed full gut rehab were selling for about $40,000. So those properties, now I know some people on this call are like, oh my God, or if you're listening on this call from another state or whatever, you're like, that's impossible. I live in LA, that wouldn't even get a garage, right? I get it, but these properties do exist. And so you can buy property outside of the area you live in as well. So just keep that in mind too. But I noticed that $40,000 property that needed a full gut rehab. I mean, it was basically like a gutted property, studs, or it needed to be gutted, was selling for about $40,000 prior to 08. When 08 hit, all of a sudden houses that weren't that bad were like $8,000 and $10,000 that didn't need a whole lot. So I found my first property. I always confuse it. I either paid $8,000 or $12,000 for it, somewhere around there. And I factored in it needed I basically could be all in for this property for $20,000. And then I knew at that point, like the numbers would make a lot of sense. So again, I'm going to dive into that in a minute. But my point is, you need to be knowing the areas. So before you even go buy a real estate piece of property, I would be out actively looking for homes in the areas that you might want to invest in. I would be looking at properties and analyzing properties constantly before you buy. I had the advantage, I was flipping homes in that area at that point in time. So I knew the market well, I knew the pricing, and I saw an opportunity when it presented itself. So you need to set goals on, am I looking for properties that cash flow really, really heavy? Or am I looking for properties that have a moderate cash flow that also have some upside appreciation, or a mix of both? Now, analyzing deals. When I'm analyzing deals, there's a thing called the 1% rule. And what the 1% rule is, it's a quick way to assess potential cash flow. I'm going to give you a quick definition on it. I'm just going to read it off my page here. The 1% rule is essentially, it is after purchasing, rehabbing the property, the monthly rent should be at least 1% of the total purchase price. So if I bought a property, if I'm all into a property for say $200,000, I would want my rent most likely to be around, if I'm $200,000 in, around $2,000 a month. The 1% rule, and that's how you can quickly gauge is the number of rent, is the rental in line with this property. If I'm buying a $300,000 property and the rent is $1,000 per month, I can instantly know that those numbers probably aren't going to make sense. So I need to figure out if is this property just priced way too high, or is it, what's going on with it? So knowing that, the 1%, that's easy math. 1% of the sale price. If I go look at a $500,000 property, the rent's $5,000 a month, I know that 1%, maybe that number makes sense. Maybe I can make sense of those numbers, possibly. There's a lot of other things I have to factor in, but that's what we do with the 1% rule. So just keep that in mind. It's essentially after purchase and rehabbing the property, the monthly rent should be at least 1% of the total purchase price. So there we go, 1% rule. Now, the other thing is I have to understand my return on investment, my ROI. And I utilize what's called a cap rate. So a capitalization rate is basically an expected return on my investment. So two things I want you to think about. One, as well as the gross rent multiplier. So before we get into capitalization rate, the gross rent multiplier is an easy way to analyze a rental property. So the gross rent multiplier is basically the fair market value by the annual gross income. So I'm going to read off my here. My gross rent multiplier, a ratio that compares a real estate property's market value to its annual gross rental income. So you can pull up calculators, and Leo, let me drop a link in here real quick on StreamYard. This is a gross rent multiplier calculator. So what this would mean is that if I'm just going to put, actually, let me just slide my screen over real quick. Let's see if you guys can see that. Come on, too many things open. Close some of this out. There we go. Okay. So if I had $100,000 on a property price and it pulled in $1,000 per month, that gives me a gross rent multiplier of 8.33. what I will tell you is that the lower this gross rent multiplier number is, the better. So if I'm getting into 10, 11, 15, 18, 20, it's not a good deal. I typically look for properties between 4 and 7 on a gross rent multiplier. This 8.33, a little bit high, but the lower this number, the better it is. So I'm taking the property price, or let's just say a property is listed at 100,000 and it's getting $1,000 per month. All right, well then I have an 8.33. Well, what if it got 1,500 per month? What's going on here? So what if it got 1,500? Now I'm looking at 5.56. Numbers are starting to make a lot more sense. This thing's got too many, too much stuff open. So this is my gross rent multiplier. This is a quick way to analyze a property. So if I go out and look at, I'm looking on MLS right now, I'm looking online, and I am, and I'm looking at properties. I can quickly look and see that, okay, this property is listed at 100. It's pulling in 1,500 a month. My gross rental income on that is $18,000. 5.56, yeah, might be worth looking at. If the rent's even higher, maybe it makes even more sense to go look at it. So the lower your gross rent multiplier number is, the better, and the more you want to go and check those properties out. So again, the lower the number, 4 to 7 is a good. Less than 4, absolutely, it's hard to find those, but between 4 and 7, I'll give you an example on my property. So the property price, I was 20. Well, I'm going to do this on a cap rate. I'll show you guys that in a moment. But that's our gross rent multiplier, as a number to keep in mind. So if you have questions on that, let me know. But the gross rent multiplier is a quick, easy way to analyze properties. Now, it gets more in depth with cap rate. So now what our cap rate does is this is giving us our net operating income. So rather than the gross, on the gross rent multiplier, I want to know what my capitalization rate is when I buy a property and I'm into this property based on the property's value, not necessarily the purchase price, but what the property is worth and the net operating income. So you can also pull a cap rate calculator, and I'm going to drag over. So with my cap rate calculator, here's what I'm going to do. If I had a property valued at $100,000, let's just say I bought it, doesn't matter what I bought it for, it's valued at $100,000, and it pulls in $1,000 per month in rent, and I have averaged 25% expenses, 25% yearly expenses. That gives me about $3,000 in expense. My vacancy rate, I'm at 0. $9,000 in net income. That gives me a cap rate of 9. So a cap rate of 9 is pretty good. That's an expected return in a sense on my money, or on this property that I can get. So if I'm getting 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, percent, I'm looking at, that's really good. Now, can the stock market beat 9? Potentially, it can. And so that's the challenge that a lot of people have. They say, well, why wouldn't I just put my money, if I only getting a 9% return effectively on this investment by buying real estate, why wouldn't I just put it into an index fund and get a 12 or 13% return? It's a good point. The thing that and this is what financial advisors will push back on this too, and say, well, just invest your money in our in a mutual fund or that, which I'm a believer in all of that as well. But what they miss is we're not just looking at this 9%. And in addition to this cap rate, I'm also getting tax savings by depreciating the property. I'm getting appreciation on the property as well as it's going up in value every year. I might gain 3 or 4% appreciation on that property every year. So now next year, my property valued at $100,000 might be $104,000. All right, so this property next year might be $104,000, and maybe I raised the rent a little bit, and my rent now went to $13,000 a year. Well, now all of a sudden my cap rate just got a little bit higher, went from 9 to 9.375. The next year it goes up, another even a little bit more, and all of a sudden it's worth 110. This thing stinks. You get my point. I'm having an issue here. This was a bad cap rate calculator to use. It's lagging. I think, yeah, there we go. Okay. right? It keeps going up. So my point is, with real estate appreciation, there we go. Cap rate continues to go up. My monthly income goes up on it, or yearly income. So the point is, real estate, you get other things other than just the cap rate. But the cap rate is something to keep in mind as well, that with this is how you can analyze properties. So I want to be looking at my potential cap rate on this. So when I'm looking at properties, what are expenses that I might encounter on property? So like with the current real estate I own right now, I'm looking every year, and I have things lined out, spreadsheets lined out on how much expense do I anticipate on these properties every year. So I know with the properties I own, I'm looking at, okay, what are the ages of the roofs on the property? So I know that with the ages of the roofs, how many years are left on this roof? When am I going to need to replace roofs? What's the age of the furnaces, the ACs, all of that? So I calculate all of that information to make sure I know what my expenses and potential upcoming expenses are going to be as well. So let me retract a little bit. Let's look at this before we get into that. Financing. So a lot of people will ask, how do I even finance a deal? How do I finance a property? And what is how do I do this? So I'll tell you what I did. You have traditional ways of financing. What I would recommend is that if you're going to get into this, a great place to start would be when you want to finance properties, to get in with local credit unions. Go to local banks, credit unions, establish a relationship with them, because they want to help you grow. Especially if you have a plan to start buying properties, more than one, you can sit down with them and talk, and they can tend to be a little bit more creative with financing your deal. So looking at credit unions there, or local banks, and establishing relationships can be a fantastic way to start getting into this. Now, before you even buy a property, I would recommend you go talk to your credit union or bank or local bank and establish a relationship. And then you need to start figuring out, what is your target market, right? So for me, back in the day, my example of, I looked at these properties on lower end type properties. I was picking stuff up for $8,000-$10,000. And what I did was I put a formula together of, I could buy a single family home and be all into it for $20,000 or less. And so with that, back in the day, I didn't have any money. I certainly didn't have any credit. I had a ton of student loan debt. And so what I did was, when I saw this stuff happening, I went to people I knew that had money, and like past clients and people like that had money. And I said, hey, we've got this opportunity. These properties are really cheap. I'm looking to buy some investment property, and would you have any interest in investing? And I showed them a plan. I said, I can buy this house for $8,000. Maybe it was 12. I always get the numbers confused, but 8 or 12 grand I paid for it. I can't remember. It was property on Oregon, 63118. And I said, we can buy this property and I can be all into it. I can manage the repairs, get it fixed up. We can be into it for less than $20,000 or less. And we can get it rented out for probably $775 to $800 a month. And so I studied the rental market in that area. I put a plan together. I went to some people. I went to one person. He said, yeah, sounds good. When do you need the money? Interesting story on that. He was going through divorce, so he was operating in cash, and he gave me 20 grand cash, just like in white envelopes. It's kind of crazy. But to buy the property, I had to take it and get a cashier's check. But anyway, it was interesting. Never held 20 grand cash at 20 something years old, right? But anyway, so you can look at different ways to finance these properties. You don't have to, go the traditional route. And what I did with the agreement with that particular investor at that point in time was, I basically said, if you finance it, I'll take care of everything. I'll get the property bought, I'll fix it up, I'll manage it, I'll get it rented out, I'll manage the rental. I'm going to pay you back your $20,000. And once I pay you back in full, we'll own the property 50-50. So we wrote up a contract, he agreed to it, and things were good. So I want to show you something on that particular property. Now, I was able to get that property. So the property value, we're going to say, was $20,000. Okay. If we can get this thing to work, I need to find a new cap rate calculator. Okay. Close all these windows out on it, huh? So on that $20,000, and then I ended up renting that property out for $25 per month, which is $9,900 in gross income. I don't remember my expenses, but I use 25% typically. So look at my cap rate was 37. There's pop-ups galore. That's why it's slow. My cap rate on that property was 37.125, which is unheard of. And it would be very, very difficult, not impossible, but difficult to find a property like that today. So this property, so people would say, oh, you got lucky. You were able to buy these properties really cheap, because I bought another one, a 4-family, for $25,000 that rented for $1,000 a month that didn't need any repairs. I bought it at a short sale. That property has a crazy value as well. So my point is, the deals do exist if you look for them. Now, they might not look for this. Did I refi that property, Joe? No. At that point in time, Joe, I did not understand how to refi properties and pull money out on equity. And we can do a separate training on that. Quickly, though, think about this. Refining property, borrowing against property, right? What you can do if once you start having a large portfolio, like let's say the rental properties I own, they're $2 million today for all the value of the property. I can borrow against those properties typically at about 80% and get that money, let's call it $1.5 million in the form of a loan. And I take that in the form of a loan, so I don't pay any income tax on it. And I get that money now. It's mine to use and spend however I want. And I don't pay income tax, and my tenants pay the loan. So that's what a lot of people do when they own property. That's another benefit of owning property, is if you don't want to pay income tax, go buy a property. Once the equity appreciates and you get appreciation on the property, and there's equity, you can borrow against that equity while your tenant continues to pay down the debt on it. And so we'll get into a separate training on that one, Joe, on how to utilize and leverage properties to pull a lot of cash out once you have a decent amount and never pay income tax again. It's pretty cool. So, but this property here, 37 cap rate. So here's what I did. So now you see what, like, again, I get that those deals might not exist like they used to. But what I then did was I went and bought another property, and I said, okay, we're getting a 37% roughly return on our money. And instead of me doing all the work, right, and then getting the money, doing all of the work, managing it all, handling everything, and then getting 50% of the property, I went to investors and said, hey, what if you loan me the money, I will give you a 10 to 12, sometimes a 15% return annually on their money. And generally, I would have them paid back in 3 years. So they were getting an annual return of somewhere between 10 and 15%. I would pay them back complete within a 3-year time frame, and then I own the property 100% myself. So I got a little bit smarter on that. But again, like, it's not a bad route either way you go. The first one I learned a lot on, and then I started to see the returns we were getting. And I say there's another way to do this. And people, what you'll find is getting money to buy property is very, very easy if you have a plan. It's very easy. You go talk to people, you give them a plan, you have a plan in place, you tell them what the plan is, how you're going to finance, what you're going to do, what the plan is, how they can expect to get the returns back. You make sure you pay them back, right? You make sure them paid back in full. And that's the one thing I always did, was even if I had expenses come up, because things will come up, I would tend to just pay those myself, and I wanted to pay them off as quick as I could. But generally in a 3-year time frame, I would have them paid off, and then I'd own the properties 100%. So there's a lot of ways to do this if you have a plan in place and you have some knowledge and know-how. Now, you're all in the real estate industry, so you're looking at properties every single day. So now it just comes time to start figuring out, how do I put a plan together to go get financing around this and make this happen? Now, again, I get the 37% cap rates probably don't exist anymore, but there are still good deals to be had if you're actively looking. So think about that and think through that. Now, let's talk about another thing here too, managing your properties. Managing your properties. Do you want to manage your properties yourself or hire a property management company? I manage all of my properties myself. I think either way is fine. So when you manage your properties yourself, you are creating, in essence, another job. And that's why I always say with real estate investing, it's not truly passive income. People are like, oh, mailbox money just comes in my account. It's really not. It's active investing. I have to go out and identify properties. I have to go look at those properties. I may need to go look at 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 properties before I even buy one. So I need to go out and actively look for properties, pursue those properties. I need to then manage the cost that it might take to get those properties fixed up and rent ready. I have to then place a tenant. I've got to screen those tenants. I've got to get them in place, get the tenant in place. I have to set up a structure for them to, to collect rent. So it's active investing. It's certainly, owning real estate is definitely not passive investing. It's active. But I can make a decision whether to manage the properties myself, or do I want to hire a property management company to take that on? If I hire a property management company to take that on, I need to factor that into my expense ratio, because there will be a cost associated with that that's going to cut into my expected return. So I need to determine between that. I need to screen tenants effectively. And then let's talk about some common landlord mistakes. So once I identify these properties, again, I manage them myself. So I'm just going to give you a quick backstory. All of my properties are Section 8. So Section 8 is a program where the government pays my tenants rent. And so there's a couple of ways to do this. There's different levels to it. Like some tenants are on a partial, where like some people that apply are approved for Section 8. It's St. Louis Housing Authority in St. Louis. They're on a partial where maybe they work and they pay a certain percentage of the rent and the government makes up the rest. Or some people are on 100% where the government pays all of their rent. And so what I found with Section 8, and I go back to that first property I bought back in the day, I had a lady call me and she said, I'm on Section 8. And I said, I'm not really familiar with that program, because I put a for rent sign in the front yard. She called off it. And she said, well, the government pays my rent. I thought that's interesting, because in my experience, the hardest part of owning rental property is collecting the rent. You'll get people that won't pay the rent, and then they'll give you half the rent, and then you're paying the house payment, if you have one, for somebody else to live in the house you own that's supposed to be making your money, but now it costs you money. So I looked at that and said, that's interesting. If the government pays 100% of the rent, I never have to go chase rent again. And back in the day, they used to do checks. They would mail checks. Now they do direct deposit. But I thought that was interesting, that program. So we started with that program, got it approved, government started paying the rent. So that was an interesting thing for me, that all of a sudden now I didn't have to worry about collecting rent, which in my opinion is one of the hardest things with owning real estate. So what happens though with people when what we'll call common landlord mistakes are, you put a tenant in there without effectively screening them. So you're anxious to get a tenant in there and start collecting money because you're paying a house payment. The house payment's coming up. You got to get somebody in there. You rush to get a tenant in there. You don't really do a background check. You don't call references. You don't call the previous landlord. You don't even have them really fill out a thorough application. You put the tenant in there, and then the nightmare begins. Things start happening where the tenant's not paying rent. More people are living there than they're supposed to, right? Things like this happen because I feel a lot of people think that I'm just going to buy a property, I'm going to rent it, the tenant's going to pay their rent every month. There's not going to be any issues. It's going to be fantastic. I'm going to make money. Not always the case, right? So not screening your tenant would be one of the biggest common landlord mistakes. So what I do is I screen my tenants, fill out a thorough application, do kind of different background checks. And then what I do as well is I have a Google Voice number set up where I don't give them my cell phone number. And what I do is I say, here's a number to call. If you have any issues with the property, call and leave a very detailed voicemail of what the issue is. And so this is a number I don't answer, because I used to give my cell phone out and then my cell phone would ring at Friday night, at 10 p.m. 400 times until I answered it. So Google Voice number set up, and then they would leave a detailed message, and then I send that voicemail to my contractor, plumber. If it's a plumbing issue, if it's an HVAC issue, if it's an electrical issue, if it's a handyman issue, I send it to them. They arrange with the tenant, coordinate to go over there. They fix it. They do a quick little walkthrough for me on the inspection, or like a quick little walkthrough to see how the house is. And they'll notify me and let me know if there's anything else, like, oh, hey, I noticed a roof leak or something like that maybe the tenant didn't report to me. So they're reporting that back to me, letting me know how the property looks. And that way, my goal is once I rent a property out, I really don't want to ever go back to the property if I don't have to. So again, time, right? The less time I have to go haul up there, and because back in the day when I first started buying these properties, I was the handyman. I was doing all this stuff. They were calling me directly on my cell phone. My phone wouldn't just never stop ringing, right? So I put a system in place where I've gotten a lot of leverage by managing my own properties, but not having to be super accessible. Now, I do have to have like annual inspections and things like that. So there is probably I don't know, a couple days, handful of days a year that kind of tie me into this. But for the returns I get and the money I make on it, it's well worth it. But just keep that in mind. Most common landlord mistake is placing a tenant without doing your due diligence on them. Got a question here. What are other options for getting financing besides asking someone to loan you the money? So yeah, again, your credit unions, your banks, right? Going to a bank, you can look at hard money loans too. I wouldn't advise against it, but if the numbers make sense, the number makes sense. So there are those companies out there that will give you a higher interest rate. But again, you have to just factor all of that into your cap rate formula and see if the numbers make sense or not. Like 20% interest probably wouldn't make any sense, right? With 8%, possibly. With 10%, maybe. All right, depends on the deal and how you structure it. But what I would say is go talk to a local bank and just tell them what you're wanting to do, put a plan together, tell them what you're wanting to do. And then they may say, no, you're not ready to do this. You're going to need X amount down. You're going to need this or that. But at least start talking to those bankers and putting a plan together to see what you need to do in order to qualify or what that looks like and how to start setting that up and structure it. Like there's nothing wrong with starting to go prepare. And then I would start going and looking at deals as well. That's the biggest thing too, is a lot of people will go buy the first deal they look at. So you don't want to do that. Sorry, I'm pulling up my, making sure we have the any questions on Facebook here too. But a lot of people will just go buy a property without analyzing. So I would advise, like right now, even if you're not in a position to go buy property, but you intend to, go start looking at them. Go start looking at as many properties as you can, seeing what's out there, seeing what's available, get to know the areas, get to know the price points, get to know what the average rental price points are as well. And so that's a way that you can start getting into the investment space without having to really pull the trigger. So, because I want to talk too about what worked and what didn't work in buying properties, challenges I faced, how I overcame them, how I built the portfolio. So I've kind of touched on how I built the portfolio and how I use that. Now, over time, I started getting good at selling real estate and making money. So I was able to start applying that money that I earned into buying properties myself. So I didn't have a need for investors any longer. But challenges I faced. Now, here's the stuff they don't tell you about on rental property. So on rental property, most of the time, not always, but you will have tenants that will not take care of the property as good as maybe you would. They live in the properties a little bit harder than maybe you do. And so you have to be prepared for that. So other things that happen is a lot of people will take on a ton of debt, and maybe it's high interest debt to buy property. So maybe they go out and buy 10 properties and they've now got $1.5 million or $2 million in debt on the property. They've got a lot of monthly mortgage payments to make. And let's say 2 or 3 of those tenants don't pay their rent that month. Well, then they need to come up with that money. So if I don't have a high income earning position, if I'm not generating a lot of income and have a lot of cash reserves, it might be very difficult for me to go start buying a ton of property, taking on a bunch of debt, and then potentially having to make house payments for people because they're not paying the rent. Stuff like that does happen. I had a client years ago that bought a property. He placed a tenant in there. She gave, I think she didn't have all of the deposit money, so she gave half of it. He was okay with it, let her move in. She didn't pay her first month's rent. He called her and she said, well, I'm not going to pay you, and I have a newborn. Good luck getting me out. So he had to go through the whole eviction process. Took about 3 months to get her out. She tore up the property. He never made a dime on it other than half the security deposit. Stuff like that does happen. So you have to be prepared for that. You buy a rental property and you move a tenant in, and they turn the AC on and it blows out. Now you have a $3,000-$4,000 cost right there. It does happen, right? Stuff like that happens. You're going to have roof issues. You're going to have, things like that happen. You have to account for that and have cash reserves in place. So that's why I recommend too, when doing this, make sure that the passive or the cash flow you're making from it, don't start spending it. Put it into cash reserves. I tend to have at least 3 to 4 months of cash reserves for each property that I have. So 3 to 4 months of rent in a cash reserve account. So that way, if anything does go wrong, I've got the money to cover it and pay for anything that might pop up. Sewer line issue, all right? Things like that happen. So think about that. Let me see. We had another question come in. Do you find there are any differences in the way Section 8 and traditional renters take care of the property? Not really. So what I would say from my experience, one of the reasons I like Section 8 is because there is a level of accountability when you have these properties, because the tenant is assigned a caseworker. So when you place a tenant there, they have a caseworker. The caseworker is going to come out and give a They're basically going to set the rent. You're gonna sign a a lease agreement with the tenant. Then you're going to fill out the housing authority Section 8 type paperwork, and then you set the rent that you want, the rent rate that you want, and then they come out and they may give you that rent, or they may negotiate with you and try to get lesser, whatever the case is. But in my experience, they do pay very well. And what I found too is that a lot of my tenants, I still have some tenants that are in my properties from 2008. A lot of them have been there long term. Now, I keep up on my property. If there's issues, we fix them right away. I don't want properties to get dilapidated and get run down. So I make sure that I keep up on stuff. I keep them nice. And so my tenants do take care of the properties. And so because of that, I rarely have turnover, which again, because it's expensive for somebody to move. We all know that. To move houses, it's not cheap. You got to either move yourself or pay movers, or it's a pain in the butt, big inconvenience. So what I found is if I take care of the properties, they tend to take care of them as well. With that said, so Section 8 from that aspect is really, really fantastic as well, because you rarely have turnover in my experience. Tenants tend to take care of the property because there is a level of accountability with having a caseworker. If people did start living in the property and that weren't supposed to be there, or let's just say there was issues, things like that, I could call their caseworker. Their caseworker could get involved. If the problem really escalated, they could potentially lose their voucher. And there's a high demand for people in that program, so they don't want to lose their housing voucher and not have housing. So in my experience, it's been really positive. I did have one negative experience, so I just like to share everything because this can happen. Years ago, maybe this was, I don't remember, 2014, I can't remember, but had a property. People were living in it. More people were moving in, like friends were staying there, stuff like that. It became it was a St. Louis City property. The sheriff, they kept getting like police calls. So it became labeled a nuisance property. So we had to evict the tenant. And so got the tenant to move out, got him evicted, got him moved out. The next day after they were out, property got broken into, all the copper got stolen, the air conditioner got stolen. Stuff like that. So the property gets just ransacked, everything gets stolen. So we get it cleaned up. Actually ended up selling that property. But then I want to say like a week or two later, I'd lived in Soulard at that point in time in the city. Somebody was banging on my door super, super loud about 7:30 in the morning. And I was upstairs. I came downstairs and I opened the door, kind of angry, what in the heck is going on here? Pounding on my door. He asked my name. I say yes. He serves me paper. So I got a lawsuit as well. That tenant that we evicted said she fell and at the property and had about 25 grand in neck and arm damages that she wanted me to pay. So that stuff can happen. So I had to get an attorney, retain an attorney. That lawsuit drug on for I think 5 or 6 years. It just recently got dropped. Maybe it was 8 years. It hit. I think there was a 5-year statute of limitations that it kind of ran its course, and then they refiled and I got served again. So maybe it went 8 or 9 years. It just recently got dropped. But anyway, it cost me 5 or 6 grand maybe to deal with that, with my lawyer and that, but it all got dropped. Nothing came of it other than just cost, right? So you have to factor that in too. Stuff like that can happen, right? Things like that can happen and you have to be prepared for it. So that's why I always advise too, if you're not in a good financial position, taking on debt and buying real estate right now might not be the best thing to do. Maybe we need to go look at increasing our real estate sales and getting our income up to a level to where if something like that happens and you were to get sued by a tenant and you have to go retain an attorney for $3,000-$4,000, it's not going to financially just crush you, right? So I think those are things to keep in mind. Are these leases used or state contracts? So you're going to have, with this, you fill out your own lease agreement. So you can use the St. Louis Association for the St. Louis Realtors here. You can use that. But then you'll also have documentation and paperwork to sign with the St. Louis Housing Authority as well that they will. So it's like a separate, it's kind of like a foreclosure deal, right? You submit the offer and then there's addendums and all of that. It's kind of like that. They're going to have their own set of paperwork as well that you'll fill out. So yeah, but so again, going back to the, buying real estate, it's something where if you don't have a lot of money, it can be a rough road. And that's what I did. I started buying it when I didn't have any money. And it was painful at times when repairs came up and things like that. I was paying for that stuff out of my pocket, right? So now in addition to just trying to cover my basic living expenses, I'm now paying to fix up this other property that maybe had an issue or whatnot. So, and then, you factor in, but fortunately, by the time I got sued on that one, I was in a decent financial position. It didn't hurt as much, but just keep that in mind. Not everybody that you place in a property will pay their rent all the time. Things happen. Now, what I will say about the Section 8, and I don't want to make this a total Section 8 like selling pitch here, but when COVID hit and people quit paying their rent, some of that did happen. Government continued to pay. And so that for me is one of the reasons I like the program so much. One, because there's a level of accountability with having a caseworker assigned to it. Two, you can tend to get into properties at maybe like you're not having to buy a $500,000 property, right? You can get into these properties for 100, 125,000 now. Like for my examples back in the day, it was 20,000, right? It's a long time ago. That doesn't really exist. But the government pays a pretty good wage on rent. They pay a really fair rental income, and you're getting direct deposited that money. So you're never having to chase rent down. You're never going to run into challenges like my client had, where the tenant moved in and said, no, I'm not going to pay you. Good luck getting me out. So pros and cons to all of it, right? For me, it's been a very positive experience overall, owning properties like that. And what I would say too, when I buy a property too, you need to look at it like this. Remember that you're not living in the property. So one of the things I do, if I buy a property, I go in. Also, let's say this too. If you're newer to investing, don't go buy a property that's a full gut rehab because it's cheaper. Oh, this one's way cheaper, but it needs tons of work. It needs all new drywall, all new floors, new cabinets, new plumbing, new bathrooms, all of that stuff. I advise against that because it's going to take you probably twice as long to get it done. Oh, we can get this done in 2 months. It'll probably take at least 4, maybe 6. Could take you a year. It's going to cost way more than you think, than you budget. So what I would advise is paying a little bit more on the purchase price, but finding properties that are more ready to go. And that's what I do now. I don't buy a ton now. I might start looking at buying some more again here pretty soon. But I look at stuff that doesn't need a lot of work, that we can get in and out of pretty quick and get a tenant in there as quickly as possible to start generating income. Because if I've got a property sitting there and I'm managing, getting it fixed up, and it's just month after month after month after month with no tenant paying rent, that property is losing me money. So I advise against finding properties that need a ton of work. I would find stuff that don't need that much work. And then also when we go in and put these properties in or fix them up, pretty simple formula. I put carpet in most of the rooms with the exception of the kitchens and bathrooms where we do vinyl type flooring. I tend to take ceiling fans out and replace them with flush mount lights, because ceiling fans, they'll run them constantly and they're going to break. And then I have a $200, $300, $400 expense replacing that ceiling fan. Ceiling fans come out, regular flush mount lights go in, everything is painted white, doors, walls, ceilings, all the same color white. Basically what I have is a very clean, basic home. It doesn't, Section 8 will not pay any additional money if I have granite as opposed to like a laminate Formica type counter. So again, I'm not making these properties like the Taj Mahal, but I'm making them a nice, safe, clean house for someone to live in. And so I can go in, and if the tenant ever does move out, it's a very basic renovation that usually can get done within a 2 to 3, sometimes 4-day time frame, where we're going in, painting the house again, running new flooring throughout, fixing any holes that might be in the walls, so on and so forth, and property's good to go, ready to be rented again. So very basic renovations. I don't do a lot of like over the top stuff, and I tend to stay away from properties that do not need a ton of work. What I would also say too is I started buying early on city properties, 100-year-old plus city properties, brick masonry, full brick houses, flat roof, porous foundation with stone. A lot of water would come into those, and they have like basement issues. I like kind of properties closer to, like, think about like North County type properties for people that live in St. Louis. They are those properties I like better because they tend to be frame type homes, siding, architectural or type, 30-year roof on them. So properties like that, I like slab properties for rentals as well. They can't fill up the basement with a bunch of stuff. So those properties do really, really well for me. They're less maintenance because on my brick homes, I have tuck pointing issues. I've got my flat roofs only last 8 to 10 years, and then we have to have work on them. Whereas another, on a single family frame type house, I could probably get 18 to 20 years out of the roof. So things like that too, from a maintenance perspective. I like more frame type, like 1950 style homes, as opposed to the 100-year-old brick homes that tend to have more issues. So I still own a lot in the city, but I started buying more stuff up north for that reason. Honestly, good price point, less maintenance, works pretty well. Do you put your properties on the HUD list? How do you find Section 8 tenants? Yeah, there is. It used to be called socialserve.org. I haven't had to place one in a while, so I can't remember. I'll have to look that up. You can go to St. Louis Housing Authority, and they will give you what their current website is, because you can list the properties on there, and then tenants will start. They can start reaching out to you. I can't remember offhand though what the website is, but you could just Google St. Louis Housing Authority, and they can direct you on what that website is that you can advertise the properties. Another tip too, I would recommend, when you place tenants, if you're going to manage the property yourself, do like an open house. So let's say you have 10 people call you wanting to potentially rent the property. Here's what I used to do. I would go to the property. A tenant would say, yeah, I can be there at 4 o'clock. Great, I'll see you there. I drive to the property. They wouldn't show up. All right, and then another one would call, I can be there tomorrow at 6. Awesome. Go to the property. They don't show up. Wasting a lot of time. So what I do now is I'll gather a bunch of people that want to see the property, and I'll say, fantastic. I'm going to be there Sunday at 12 o'clock. Come on by. And then the people that show up, if I had 10 people, 6 of them might show up at 12 o'clock, and I can knock out talking to them. I can have them fill out an application, and then I can determine which tenant might be the best fit for my property, and then go from there. So that's just a little tip too that I would just tell you guys about, because I used to spend lots of time driving to the property and nobody would show up. So I just set like an open house, and I just do I don't even do a time frame. I just said 12 o'clock. I'll be there at 12, or whatever the time is on Sunday, 1 o'clock on Sunday. Come on by. We can talk, take a look at the property. If you like it, we can fill out an application. They fill out an application, and then I can go do my screening and determine which tenant I want to put in there. So again, I think it's a good program. I like it. Christy just said affordable housing. It does provide affordable housing for people. There we go, affordablehousing.com. Thank you, Christy. There's a website there. Affordablehousing.com. But in my experience, we're providing a nice home for a person, and it's a nice, clean, safe home. And I keep up again on the properties. If there's issues, we fix them right away. We make sure that the properties don't get run down, because I have had tenants move in from other properties where they had things like significant roof leaks, or the furnace was out, or like the furnace wouldn't get up to a certain temperature, whatever the case may be. And that's just not cool. Like, I'm a big believer in treating people the way you want to be treated. So I like to make sure we're providing a safe, clean house for our tenants. And because of that, that's why I think we have a lot of long-term tenants that stay a long time, because they don't want to move, because they have a nice place that gets kept up on. So that's about all I've got. Any other questions? I appreciate everybody being on right now. Any other questions? But Lisa, I know you're on Facebook. Christy posted affordablehousing.com. So take a look at that for Section 8 listings, affordablehousing.com. Again, owning real estate, fantastic opportunity to generate and create wealth. But just know, again, it's not truly passive. A lot of people that sell programs and that, they'll say, oh, it's so easy, it's this or that. There is more to it. It's an active investing. It can be fantastic, but it is active. It is taking on, in some sense, another job in some instances. Now, you could just invest your money. If you have money, invest it and have somebody else go do all the legwork like I used to do back in the day. That's always an option as well. Now you're quote unquote a real estate investor. You can invest in things like real estate, like a REIT, a real estate investment trust. The challenge with those, not the challenge, the difference is you're not going to get all of the tax benefits that you could by doing it yourself. Like, I have an uncle and some cousins that invest in big apartment projects. And so they invest, they get a return on their money, they're happy with it. And that's great. You can do stuff like that. The only difference is they're not getting the full benefit of owning that real estate, in my opinion, because we're not necessarily getting the tax advantages that come with owning the real estate. So check it out. Again, if you're wanting to get into this, I highly advise you to go start looking at specific areas and go start looking at the properties in those areas and get a feel for what homes are selling for, and then get a feel for what the rent rates are in those areas as well. Start studying those properties, and then you'll be ready when a good deal pops up. You might be ready to jump on it. So hope that was helpful. If you have questions, as always, call, email anytime. And that's all I've got for today. So thank you all for being on. Again, if you have questions, we'll hang out for a few minutes and answer any questions you have. And we'll talk with you all soon. Thank you, everybody.